For me, the most interesting thing is, beyond a doubt, the fact we get to see both Frasier and Daphne smoking. Hello, and welcome to the 27th installment of Frasier Fridays, where all the salads are tossed and all the eggs are scrambled. Today, we're looking at the third episode of Season 2, entitled The Matchmaker. It originally aired on October 4th, 1994, and attracted 22.4 million viewers. This is a nice climb of just under 2 million viewers from the previous week's outing, and well above the season average of 21.1 million viewers. At the same time, for this week, both Seinfeld and the next James Burrows directed episode of Friends dropped. On the Friends front, this was definitely to be expected. The show is still finding its footing, and will have to probably wait another few weeks before it settles into its core audience. The Seinfeld drop is a little more surprising. It fell by almost 3 million viewers week over week. This is a rather large tumble for the ratings juggernaut, and a disappointing third outing for Andy Ackerman's direction on the series. Back on the Frasier front, we have a David Lee directed episode here, returning for his third of 41 direction spots. His last episode was the excellent A Midwinter Night's Dream. We talked about Lee at length there, and I commented his direction definitely showed some stage direction inspirations. And that's the case again here. Especially in the later shots of the episode, you can really see this influence coming through. All respect to James Burrows and his contributions to the Frasier's, Cheers, and Wings productions, but at this point, Lee is probably my second favorite Frasier director after Ackerman. On the writing front this week, we have Joe Keenan turning in his first script. Keenan's an interesting guy with quite a bit of comedy chops, and he will write another 23 episodes of the series over the next 10 years. But that's not close to all he'll be doing on Frasier. In fact, of all the cast and crew members we've looked at thus far, Keenan is the one who, professionally, has benefited the most from his time on Frasier. Keenan didn't start out as a TV writer. His first major writing achievement was actually a 1988 novel entitled Blue Heaven, which involves a couple planning to get married only for the wedding gifts. I haven't read it, but based on the reviews, it sounds like it could still be made into a sitcom today. In 1991, James Burrows and the other Cheers creators got a hold of a copy of the book, and they thought it was quite funny, and actually reached out to Keenan to pitch a script. He created a pilot for a show called Gloria Vane, starring Jo Beth Williams, our guest caller from episode 8, which ultimately didn't end up getting picked up. Despite this, the production company was still a big fan of Keenan's, and brought him on as an executive story editor, which led to him writing this episode of Frasier. From there, he slowly rose through the ranks of the series, working as the aforementioned executive story editor, then a co-producer, a supervising producer, a co-executive producer, and ultimately an executive producer at the time of the series' end. He won a total of 5 Emmys and numerous nominations during his time on the show. From there, he's done production on a number of series, including Out of Practice, Desperate Housewives, Glee, the newest iteration of The Odd Couple, and Why Women Kill. He's also written 2 episodes of Hot in Cleveland, and created 2 short-lived comedy series, Bram and Alice and Out of Practice. We start the episode out with another brand new introduction this week, and that's a helicopter taking off from one of the buildings. From there, we move into the episode, starting with an interesting opening scene, where a fire alarm sounds in Frasier's apartment, pulling everyone up from their slumber. Daphne says it went off in her room, but she doesn't know why. A minute later, Eddie blows her cover by bringing out a box of Marlboros and dropping them in front of him. This scene actually gave us 2 little pieces of information that aren't new here. The first is that Daphne smokes when she's really stressed out, and the second is that Eddie apparently sleeps in Daphne's bed. I just assumed, being Martin's dog, that he slept with Martin, but apparently that isn't the case. We get what's probably the most in-character Frasier moment of the episode, where Frasier walks away from Daphne when she says she's upset, only to have the guilt hit him and walk back in a moment later. It's an obvious script point and a nearly generic sitcom thing to do, but it's also perfectly in character for Frasier. This leads to Frasier and Daphne bemoaning their failures of a love life, and gives us a quick reference to Frasier's ill-fated engagement to Diane. This is a fun exchange and some fun callbacks, but not the most interesting thing to happen here. For me, the most interesting thing is, beyond a doubt, the fact we get to see both Frasier and Daphne smoking. Throughout the early 2000s on television and in movies, it became a lot more controversial to show smoking on screen, and by 2013, all major studios had instituted rules that they wouldn't show smoking on network television or in movies not rated R. I remember this being exceptionally controversial in the 2014 Hellblazer, or Constantine series, because smoking is one of the main character's chief attributes, and it actually led to a number of storylines. The show ended up showing him dropping butts and holding cigarettes, but it could never actually show him inhaling. The cool casualness with which it happens here is really interesting, given you would never see something like this today in a sitcom that was rated anything less than TV mature. Our next scene finds Roz in the wild, where she runs into Frasier at Cafe Nervosa. As much of a joy as it always is to see Roz outside of the studio, the real treat and surprise here is Roz has a little black book full of all the men she's dated. On Cheers, Sam had the exact same thing for all of his conquest. I'm sure Keenan brought this tidbit in only because of its prominence on Cheers. I know we're going to be getting an episode where Sam shows up for a visit later this season, and yes, Sam had grown up quite a bit beyond his old doggish ways by the end of Cheers, but if we don't get at least some great flirting between Sam and Roz, I'm going to be sorely disappointed. Frasier and Roz have something resembling a fight over Roz's love life and her little black book when it comes to Daphne. We've seen that Frasier and Martin are both pretty protective of Daphne in the past, so it's not really a surprise to see him being this way here. Niles is, of course, still acting on his infatuation with Daphne and becomes really protective of her against Roz and her exes, and says some pretty nasty things to Roz. This is a nice change from their interactions last season, which were routinely Niles not knowing who she was. Now Niles remembers who Roz is, and it just actively insults her. Roz, of course, doesn't take that lightly, and calls Niles a little titmouse, which is a type of bird in the chickadee family, and in her defense, he sort of does resemble one. This leads to a great reaction shot from Niles, probably the best of the episode, and results in Roz storming out of the cafe. Our next scene opens in the radio station with another interesting anachrony. This time with Frasier and Roz performing a test of the emergency broadcast system. The EBS was in existence from 1963 until 1997, so this is right at the tail end of that. It was replaced by the Emergency Alert System, or EAS, at that point in time. During the time the EBS was still active, all broadcast stations were required to do a weekly test of the system at a random time between 8:30 a.m. and local sunset. So it's not something Frasier was guaranteed to get every week, or even very often. But it's something that likely would have happened on his show, at least periodically. It's a really cool bit of history to see in the show, and it's something I'm very glad got included in here, as it's a piece of media we don't see anymore today. The EAS today still has similar tests to this, but only the monthly tests are required to be done between 8:30 a.m. and sunset instead of weekly tests. These alerts also consist of the cell phone alerts, which many of you probably remember included a false missile alert over Hawaii back in 2018. This brings us to our main guest star of the episode, and the first new member of the KACL family in a little while. And that's the new station manager, Tom Duran, played by Eric Lutz. This is the first of two appearances Lutz will make as this character. Lutz got his start with a bit part in the 1987 horror comedy Psychos in Love, before scoring a 6-episode part on All My Children. From there, he'd do occasional one-offs, including a spot on Ellen and Mad About You, before landing a leading role in Carolyn in the City. He hasn't succeeded in landing any more recurring roles since then, but has appeared on a number of shows and kept quite busy, making appearances varying from House to Desperate Housewives to a Weird Al Yankovic music video to Days of Our Lives. He's a solid character actor and still very active today. Also, I can't think of a much more 90s look than his character design is here. At this point, I'm going to draw some pretty heavy comparisons to one or two Seinfeld episodes, depending on how you count it. Frasier and Tom hit it off almost immediately, bonding over the opera and foreign ties, and Frasier quickly thinks he's found the perfect match for Daphne. The dialogue makes it sound like Frasier is hitting on Tom and asking him out. Yes, that's the point, and yes, that's where all the drama in this episode leads from, but it made me think a lot of the 2-part Seinfeld episode, The Boyfriend and The New Friend, where Jerry became friends with one of Elaine's boyfriends. In that episode, every line of dialogue about Jerry seeing this new friend was coded so it was the same kind of language one uses when discussing a dating relationship. It was a pretty funny episode and worked really well in that context, although it maybe could have been 1 part instead of 2. Anyway, this whole scene just left me thinking of that, until we hit the very next scene, with a discussion between Roz and Tom, where Tom reveals himself to be gay. No, this wasn't surprising. In a modern context, this was very well set up, and a pretty obvious reveal. But for 1994, this was a bit more shocking. Yeah, we had a few gay jokes on Cheers, so it's not like this was untreaded territory for the Frasier crew, but this episode was still somewhat transgressive for the time it aired. Frasier sets up what he thinks is going to be a date between Daphne and Tom, and we get a particularly funny bit of physical acting from Grammer, as he mimics the strapless little number that Daphne should wear for the big date. We don't get a lot of physical humor on the show, and even this little bit is a nice change of pace from the normal jokes we get. Niles shows up to crash Frasier's matchmaking with the excuse that he's returning a book. It seems like about 50% of the books on the show aren't actual titles, which is interesting, and I'm guessing is done for legal reasons. The book in this scene is one such example of a book that doesn't exist. The book is titled The Bifurcated Self, and the author is Stephen something that ends in D-L-E-R. A bifurcation of self is a psychological theory, but there's never been a book by this name, and certainly not one by anyone named Stephen with those last few letters for his last name. So the book is an interesting set piece that has no ties to real life. From here, the episode winds down. The rest of it is the play out of Daphne or Frasier's date, depending on how you want to look at it. As the episode wraps up, we get to see part of the Space Needle in the backdrop for one of the first times since the pilot. We don't see the top of the needle here, but we do get to see the legs, which is very unusual for the show. In fact, this is about the best look we've ever had at backdrop, and it looks pretty good. Except for the fact that none of the lights move, which makes it become very apparent this is a backdrop as the scene goes on. The episode ends with Frasier setting the confusion right and a few funny comments about Niles and Martin also not being gay. Right before we get there, there is an excellent shot of Tom trying to seduce Frasier, and it shows why David Lee knows what he's doing. The shot is perfect and conveys what he was going for here, and is probably part of why he won the Directors Guild Award for this episode. We get more of those strange smoking shots in the coda of this episode. It's a solid coda, but not nearly as strong as last week's. It's kind of funny having both Frasier and Daphne look at the Surgeon General's warning, but considering those have been on cigarette cartons since the 1960s, it only lands so much. Frasier only sports one tie this week, and it's a new one. While both of Niles are repeats. Niles' first tie was last seen in episode 16, while his second one last showed up in episode 22. This brings us up to a total of 58 ties between the two brothers, 30 for Frasier, and 28 for Niles. This episode scored a ton of awards. As previously mentioned, it won the Directors Guild Award for this episode. It also won the Directing Emmy for David Lee, the 4th place in Entertainment Weekly's Reader's Favorites of the Year list, a Writers Guild of America award, and a GLAAD Media award. In addition to this, it scored 2 other Emmy nominations for camera editing and writing that it did not succeed in winning. This episode won a lot of awards and a ton of praise for good reason. All the actors were on top of their acting game this week. Niles and Roz going at it was a delight and showcased both of their acting range. Frasier was a great actor as always, and Daphne got to shine as a woman who was depressed about her love life. On top of that, our guest star, Eric Lutz, shows why he was selected as one of the leads in Carolyn in the City following this episode. The direction is also top-notch here, and as much as I was, and still am, very impressed with Barron's direction and wrangling of the 4 young puppies last week, I have to admit Lee is the stronger director of the pair. And even though the puppies were great, I see why Lee is the one who won the directing award. All of that brings us to Keenan's script. The script is handled well, all the characters are spot on, and I absolutely loved Roz and Niles going at it. With that said, this episode can't help but feel a little generic, in light of where sitcoms are today. If I really wanted to, I'm sure I could sit here and name off the dozen shows that have come out since this one, which had a plot involving a character being gay, and one of the main characters not realizing it. That isn't to say that it shouldn't be done. In fact, the jokes are almost always funny. It just feels a bit reductive of what we've seen before. Or in this case, what will come to be. That minor complaint aside, the only other thing that really sticks out to me as a negative from this episode is the backdrop of Seattle from Frasier's balcony. It was so clearly a still shot, it really took me out of the scene for a bit. From a distance, it's never mattered before because we weren't close enough to see the fine details. This week, the cast was close enough to it to see the details of the backdrop, and boy, did it stick out. These nitpicks aside, this episode won all the awards it did for a good reason. Join Frasier as he learns the perils of refinement, and give this 8.5 out of 10 episode of Frasier a watch.